As we have discussed, the Constitution was written after an attempt was made to amend the Articles of Confederation. At the widely unsuccessful Annapolis Convention, where discussions emerged to improve commercial relations among states, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton persuaded the other delegates to meet in Philadelphia in order to revise the Articles of Confederation. After a number of states elected delegates to the proposed Philadelphia Convention, Congress consented to give its approval to the meeting. It called upon all 13 states to send delegates to Philadelphia. Only Rhode Island refused to send delegates. We're going to look at the major issues faced by the Founding Fathers, beginning with a brief overview of the Articles and moving through to George Washington's first term. Four years separated the signing of the Treaty of Paris and the meeting of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. During that time, the government operated under the Articles of Confederation. The country faced several major problems under this government. Foreign relations were non-existent or strained. States failed to adhere to the Treaty of Paris by ignoring loyalist rights and repayment of pre-war debt, and British troops remained in the country. Credit was difficult to obtain as debt repayment was ignored. The 13 states did not trust one another, thus creating a less than unified nation. Interstate commerce was restricted or heavily taxed, and border disputes were common. While misses were apparent, some land cessions were granted. As natives were pushed further and further west, land opened to the former colonists for farming, especially in the South. Natives in these territories were either forced to move or assimilated. Either way, trade was open to the natives and the Spanish. Unfortunately, Spain negotiated a separate treaty with Britain. Spain had Indian allies, and American settlers were not permitted to ship their goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. Under the Articles, John Jay was sent to negotiate with the minister of Spain. His mission was to gain financial aid, make commercial treaties, and ask for recognition of the U.S. by Spain. Spain was unwilling to comply for fear Spain's colonies would begin a revolution. A treaty was proposed by Jay to Congress, but it gave very little to the U.S. and Congress rejected it. In this map, you can see how the states surrendered land claims to Congress. This opened the door for Congress to establish regulations concerning land distribution and statehood. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 became one of the few accomplishments under the Articles. It set basic principles for surveying the frontier, and it set the precedent for banning slavery. Statehood was received in 3 stages, which began with territorial status and was finally accomplished based on population. When the delegates met in Philadelphia, some wanted to see revisions made to the Articles, and many wanted to start fresh. What remained consistent, however, were the ideals of a virtuous republic. These values included government authority as is given by the people, elections should be held frequently, rights should be guaranteed, power should be limited, and a written constitution should be present. Most importantly, the Founding Fathers wanted to instill the practice of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood notes the values and principles of a republic should be passed down through generations. The responsibility lies with the parents to raise their children to be good citizens. Americans in the 1780s generally distrusted government and feared that officials would seize every opportunity to abuse their powers, even if they were popularly elected. Madison and the other delegates wanted a new constitution to be based on a system of checks and balances, so that the power of each branch would be limited by the powers of the others. One issue facing the framers of the Constitution was representation within Congress. The Virginia plan favored large states by giving more representation based on population, and the New Jersey plan favored smaller states. A compromise was presented by Roger Sherman called the Connecticut Compromise. It provided for a two-part House Congress. In the Senate, states would have equal representation, but in the House, each state would be represented according to the size of its population. While the goal was to create a stronger central government, the concern had to be a system of checks and balances. Three branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial, were created along with specific duties granted to each. With shared powers, no branch of government could get too powerful. Additionally, shared powers were present between the federal and state governments. This is known as federalism. Examples might include the national government controls national defense, coining money, and so on, while the states make laws concerning education, slavery, marriage, and so on. The key to the Constitution is flexibility. The framers needed to create a document that would stand the test of time. Clearly, the Articles were not that document. And so, with the addition of the Bill of Rights, or at least the agreement to add the Bill of Rights, the Constitution was ratified. Washington faced a series of issues at the beginning of his presidency. As Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton's goal was to strengthen the nation against foreign enemies and lessen the threat of disunion. Under the Articles, Congress failed to pay interest on revolutionary debt. This misstep hurt America's credit. The nation needed to become self-sufficient, and Hamilton felt this goal could be satisfied through assumption. Through assumption, the central government could pay on the principal, thus decreasing the interest and therefore the debt. The taxpayers would see minimum expense and keep the nation's credit afloat. Hamilton also proposed the possibility of a national bank. Through public stock offerings, the central government could raise $10 million. A national bank would cost the taxpayers nothing. It would regulate business practices of state banks and provide credit, thus increasing the economy. The effects of the national bank was self-sufficiency, increased industry, increased immigration, protective tariffs on American goods, and military funding. Hamilton's opposition cited the national bank would lead to corruption and was unconstitutional. Hamilton took a broader view of the Constitution, arguing that the document's necessary and proper clause authorized Congress to do whatever was necessary to carry out its powers. Washington approved the bill and signed a 20-year charter. The protective tariffs increased prices and created an urban poor, unfortunately. Washington faced a test on the Constitution and the central government's power with the Whiskey Rebellion. In order to raise revenue, Hamilton proposed a tax on whiskey. Western Pennsylvanian farmers were affected the most. These farmers were unable to ship their crops to world markets, so they distilled rye or corn to create whiskey. The excise tax equaled 25% of the whiskey's retail value, eating into the farmers' profits. The law was enforced in Western Pennsylvania and rarely anywhere else. Rebellion broke out, and Washington sent the militia scattering the rebellion. The event showed the limits of public opposition and proved the strength of the Constitution. Washington told the rebels, "If you want change, vote change." When dealing with the natives, Washington wanted to see a shift from war to trade. War and invasion of Indian lands led to chaos and was unproductive. Guidelines were established which included laws prohibiting trespassing on Indian lands, punishment for crimes by non-Indians, laws outlawing alcohol, regulated trade with the Indians, and the Indians were encouraged to become civilized or assimilate into American culture. The importance of Washington's policy freed up land for non-Indians peacefully. Diplomacy was clearly important to the strength of the infant American nation. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where General Anthony Wayne defeated Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, chieftains of the Western Confederacy, attempting to stop American advancement into what is today Ohio, the Treaty of Greenville opened up the Western lands to Americans. The win also allowed John Jay to secure a treaty with the British that promised British withdrawal from the frontier forts. Jay's treaty with the British also gained West Indies markets, trade, and diffused a future crisis. However, the U.S. lost rights to load cargoes of sugar, molasses, and coffee from the Caribbean. The treaty gave the British allowances to violate American neutrality, which will come to light on the eve of the War of 1812. It ruined profitable commerce, failed to end impressment, and the British never returned the slaves they took during the Revolution. While the stimulation of trade was valuable, Jay's treaty opened the door for what will become the War of 1812. Totally unexpected was the effect that the Jay Treaty had on Spain's policy towards the territories in the Americas. Seeing the treaty as a sign that the United States might be drawing closer to Spain's longtime foe, Britain, Spain decided to consolidate its holdings in North America. The Spanish influence in the far west had been strengthened by a series of Catholic missions along the California coast, but they were concerned about their colonies in the southwest. Thomas Pinckney, the U.S. minister to Spain, negotiated a treaty in which Spain agreed to open the lower Mississippi River and New Orleans to American trade. The right of deposit was granted to Americans so that they could transfer cargoes in New Orleans without paying duties to the Spanish government. Spain further agreed to accept the U.S. claim that Florida's northern boundary should be at the 31st parallel. In the end, Washington was able to accomplish peace in the frontier, open the Mississippi River for exports, regain British markets, stay out of war, and do his best to condemn political parties. He stated that political factions only endangered the Union's survival. So the essential question is to research and explain George Washington's views on factions, foreign policy, and alliances.